Hey everyone, I'm Coach Kyle of Freedom Running Club, and I've got a brand new study here that I'm really excited to break down with you. Some really interesting training applications for anybody who's getting ready for distance races. Probably if you're watching this, you're into distance running, and things I've already put into place for my runner in terms of safely applying new mileage. And it involves the 10% rule, but not in the way that you've ever really looked at before. So let's go ahead and break down the study and the evidence and see what kind of maybe you can take away from it, things that I've already taken away from this study. So essentially, the study came out in 2024. So again, pretty new study here, a little over a year old. The principal author, his name is Franz, and I'll put the study up here and I'll put the link in the caption down below like I always do. And this was a very, very big study. It looked at 5,205 people in this cohort study. And I'm going to be looking down at the study here, and I'm going to be putting portions of it up on the screen so you can see it. And this studied people for a very long time, for 18 months. There were 22% of the participants in this were female, so much more heavily male-centric in this study, with a mean age of 45.8, so a little bit older, but an average training age of 9.5 years. So we're talking about, these are not novices, these are people that have been training for almost a decade, essentially. So quite experienced runners, essentially. And the way they collected their data was from their Garmin devices. So obviously only Garmin users could be included in this study. Coros, Apple Watch, or anything else could not be included in the study. So take all these things for along with how they're gathering this data. But essentially, for the most part, people, if they're doing a run, they're probably recording it on their device. There might be a couple here and there that wouldn't for one reason. Maybe their watch was dead or something like that. But for the most part, this is not relying on people's memory. This isn't like a survey-based study, which is fantastic, because a lot of times to get this big of a study, you're relying purely on surveys, which is going to be relying on people's memory. This isn't doing that. This is on the device's memory that's being stored for 18 months. So I think it's actually kind of a pretty good, reliable source of what these people are doing. So there were three main things that we're trying to look at in terms of injury rate for these people. So the first one they were looking at is session specific. So they were looking at what was the longest long run in the last 30 days, and was that increasing, decrease, was that relating to injury rate in any way? So looking at the single longest session in that 30-day span. They were also looking at 1 week in terms of miles relating to the previous 3 weeks. So I think that's the way people usually think of that 10% rule, like don't increase your miles more than 10% than the previous week. And then there was a week-to-week ratio. They were looking at some different things in terms of that. If you're interested in how they kind of compiled that ratio, it's in the whole study. It's not super complicated to read. I think it was about 15 pages long. Again, it's in the caption down below. If you want to take a look at it yourself, highly recommend. If you're really interested in this, take a look at it yourself. But let's go ahead and summarize what some of these things are that they found. So of that 5,205 people over those 18 months they were looking at this, 1,820 sustained some type of running injury during that time frame. So that was 35% of the people, more than a third, sustained some kind of running related injury over those 18 months. And what they found in this, significant increased rates after the single run spiking by more than 10% than the previous longest run from the last 30 days, okay? So that's what was the most related to these injuries. Now, obviously, we're looking at, there was a run like this, and then there was an injury. That's, putting things together. It's not necessarily causation. But again, when we're looking at 35% of it, and it was very much, associated with this single longest run being more than 10% than the previous longest run within that 30 days, that's pretty compelling information. And they didn't find that same association on the week-to-week or the week ratio, the week ratio, the week-to-week, or the 1 week versus the previous 3 weeks, which again, the 1 week to the previous week or the previous 3 weeks, that's what people usually talk about when they're talking about a 10% rule. So that's really interesting here. So I want to read a couple of things directly from the text here. So basically what the authors were saying when they kind of completed this was, caution is advised when relying on recommended training load calculations such as an acute chronic workload ratio and weekly gradual changes, as no association or even inverse association between these approaches and injury risk was found. Okay, so that's kind of interesting there. So it's this idea of, it's not the ratio and it's not the weekly gradual, okay? It was very specifically looking at that long run. And again, people maybe want to kind of change the way they're looking at it based on that finding they just said. they are suggesting what they're calling a paradigm shift in terms of how we're looking at mileage for people. And basically what they're talking about is a single session paradigm, essentially, to promote safer approach. And this is what I'm calling my new 10% rule, essentially. I'm really looking at this specifically ever since I looked at the study, and it's always been pretty close to that. I'm not one who really tries to really rely on the long run, even for my marathon runners. I always say you're the totality of all of your training, not just a long run. But for people that are really kind of trying to get a lot of miles in on their long run, or maybe you've had a down week for one reason, maybe you did a race and then maybe you got sick and maybe you missed a couple long runs and you try to just pick up exactly where your plan left off, that might be flirting with disaster here. So these are the kinds of things that this study really suggests, kind of changing, again, that paradigm of a new 10% rule, essentially, to a single session paradigm. So take a look at it, and you could do this basically. I'm looking at both in terms of time and mileage. Again, I usually give all of my runs in terms of time for my athletes, but I know essentially what that's going to be in terms of their mileage based on, I give them a top end, don't run faster than this, essentially. I think the conclusion is also really interesting, so I want to read that directly. A significant increase in the rate of running-related overuse injuries was found when the distance of a single running session exceeded 10% of the longest run undertaken in the last 30 days. So that's basically just what I was summarizing before. That's really sort of prominent, right? There's no sort of hedging that. So when you're looking at your long runs, and this is where we're going to kind of step into, again, the takeaway from this, just be very careful of what that long run looks like. Everybody tries to get to say that 20 miles is a really kind of big number for people if you're getting ready for a marathon, or 3 hours or something like that. Remember, you have to earn those things to safely get to that point. And again, this is my opinion. This is not from the author here. You really have to earn those long runs being that long. You have to gradually get to that point safely. Because again, it doesn't matter if you ran 20 miles in your progression if you're injured on race day, right? And again, this suggests, a pretty high percentage of the people in this study, again, they were following them for 18 months, so injuries are going to happen when you're running, but of that 35%, it being very significantly associated when the long run was more than 10% of the previous long run within 30 days. So again, you've got time to get that up. That doesn't mean that, oh man, my long run this week is 10% longer than the week before or more than. No, we're talking about 30 days here. So we're still talking about, you can ramp yourself up in a safe manner, but just make sure you're doing that in a way that you can be safely to race day. Again, I've already put this into place for my athletes. If you have any questions about maybe how that could apply for you, especially if you're someone that's maybe not able to run as many days as you want during the week and you're having trouble safely getting your long run up, you can ask those in the comments down below. You can also schedule a free strategy session. I'd love to sit down and kind of see how things like this could apply to your training, reaching your goals and everything. But yeah, real interesting study. I really recommend anybody taking a look at it. It really is an interesting shift in what we consider that 10% rule that everybody thinks they know.